Hello, these are Flipnotes 1.5 brain structures, and we are digging deep into parts of the brain. Let's go.
The brain can be divided into three main regions: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain, with the forebrain being the largest and the hindbrain being the most basic and essential things needed for life. The hindbrain developed first, and it's found in primitive creatures as well as in humans. This is most basic functioning, so things like breathing, heart rate, balance, and movement. It includes the top part of the spinal cord, so where the spinal cord comes up and meets the brain. There's several key parts there, including the pons, the medulla, the reticular formation, and the cerebellum. For each of these brain parts, or most of these brain parts, I'm going to give you a mnemonic or a memory trick to remember them. And I usually remember the hindbrain just by saying, don't fall behind on the essentials. Don't fall behind on the essentials, and those include breathing, heartbeat, sleeping, balance, reflexes, which are all things done by those multiple brain parts of the brainstem. So specifically, the cerebellum is one of them. The cerebellum is this red part down here. Cerebellum translates to little brain because it literally looks like there's a little brain hanging off the back of the main part of your brain. This is the front. Over here on the right is the back of the brain, and here's your spinal cord and your brain stem coming up to meet the rest of the brain. The cerebellum helps to coordinate fine muscle movement. So when you're doing things like writing, having to grip your pencil and move your wrist, trying to type, or even playing an instrument, which requires lots of finger movement. The cerebellum processes balance and posture. And the cerebellum is also one of the first parts of the brain affected by alcohol. So when somebody is taking that drunk test on the side of the road, where they're asked to put their finger to their nose and to walk in a straight line, all of that stuff can be challenging because the cerebellum processes balance and posture. And if it's already affected by alcohol, they can't do those things. And another big job of the cerebellum is it helps to process implicit or procedural memories. Procedural memories are things we can do without thinking, or muscle memory type things. So things like playing the piano or playing the flute without having to think about each movement of your fingers. My mnemonic here, Sarah is balancing a bell. I really could add to it by putting her maybe on a balance beam, showing her trying to walk or maybe play the flute at the same time, and maybe adding some alcohol, beer bottles down at the bottom so we can remember that the cerebellum is first affected by alcohol. The medulla is our next part here. These are all part of the hindbrain. So as you come up the spinal cord, there's sort of two big lumps here on the spinal cord, and the first one you come to is the medulla. The full name of the medulla is the medulla oblongata, but we more often just call it the medulla. And its big job is that it regulates several unconscious functions, primarily breathing and respiration. It plays a role in circulation of the blood throughout the body, helping to maintain muscle tone, some of the reflexes like sneezing, coughing, salivating, but all the most vital processes, but the main one being heart rate, respiration, and blood pressure. My mnemonic for medulla is I think medulla sounds like Medusa. And maybe you've learned before about Medusa, the myth that if you stared at her in the eyes, you would turn to stone. She had that hair full of snakes. So Medusa can take your breath away because medulla controls breathing, and it would stop your breathing and your heart rate if you stared at Medusa. Medusa, medulla. My next one is the pons. The pons is sort of this next kind of bump here up on the spinal cord and the brain stem. The pons is a bunch of different fibers that are actually holding that cerebellum to the brain stem, connecting the brain stem to the cerebellum. The pons' big job is sleep and then arousal from sleep. It does have other jobs related to respiration and cardiovascular functions, eye movements, which makes sense because while you're asleep, your eyes are moving back and forth, and we'll talk about that in another section. The big thing for pons is sleep and arousal. So in my image here, we've got a brain connected to a spinal cord. So it's the bridge between the brain and the spinal cord. And most importantly, we've got a puppy sleeping by a pond. So sleeping by the pond is the ponds. So ponds, pond, sleeping by the pond. Our next one, and this one is actually kind of not a specific bump on the brainstem, but kind of sort of inside there. And this is called the reticular formation, also known as the RAS or the reticular activating system. And it has a big job of telling the brain that there are incoming signals. So this is really kind of one of the first stops at the very top of the spinal cord. As signals are coming up the spinal cord, they stop at the RAS and say, hey, pay attention, wake up brain, we got signals coming in here. So the reticular formation alerting the brain to incoming signals. Other things, reflexes, breathing, pain perception. If you had damage to the reticular formation, you'd be in a coma because your brain would not wake up to incoming signals. So my way I remember this one is I think reticular formation sounds like a particular military formation. So I picture there at that RAS in the spinal cord that there's a soldier there or a group of soldiers and they're waiting, standing at alert, waiting for incoming signals coming up the spinal cord to tell the brain, hey, pay attention. So reticular particular military formation. So a quick recap here of our hindbrain. Again, the hindbrain includes the brainstem, the reticular activating system, the medulla, the pons. All of these help to process our most basic functions. In this picture over here, you can see how this kind of comes up the spinal cord, the top of the spinal cord, and then the rest of the brain sort of wraps over that. And we've got one more image of the brain here. And this one's showing us our cerebellum. So from our side view, the cerebellum does look like that kind of mini wrinkly brain here that's hanging off the back. But from this other view, we can see that the cerebellum does literally wrap around the brain stem. So all of that part of the hindbrain. All right, our next region of the brain is the midbrain, and we don't really have a whole lot to remember for this one. Pretty easy to locate because the hindbrain is the midbrain is located between the hindbrain and the forebrain. It's this green area on our diagram. And the big thing about the midbrain is that it creates dopamine. So dopamine synthesis happens there. Lots of neurons that are creating dopamine neurotransmitters are there. We know that dopamine plays a role in voluntary movements. And then we also know that dopamine is a major pleasure center. So this is part of the reward pathway. We know that if we have not enough dopamine being produced, that is linked to Parkinson's disease. So if there's damage to the midbrain, that would also be linked to Parkinson's. We wouldn't be able to produce enough dopamine. My mnemonic for this one is I say dopamidbrain makes dopamine. Dopamidbrain makes dopamine. All right, our next region of the brain is the biggest one, and it is the forebrain, the top orange section here. The forebrain is the largest and most complex. It's much bigger in humans. It includes the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex, which is all the wrinkly area. And then underneath the cortex, we've got a bunch of subcortical structures, things under the cortex, including the thalamus and the limbic system, which is made up of several more parts, including the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the pituitary gland. So the cortex, or formerly the cerebral cortex, we usually will just call it the cortex, is all of that wrinkly outer layer of the brain. But that's not just wasted area. That's where we're storing all kinds of memories. They're stored throughout there. All kinds of higher information processing is happening in the cortex. And we'll actually get more into the cortex in the next section of notes. But the cortex is larger in humans because, again, that's where our most high-level thinking and memory processing is happening. Things that humans can do, but other creatures cannot. In this diagram here, it's a little bit hard to see the colors, but the purple area are motor areas. And in the rat here, it's pretty much dominated by motor and sensory areas. Association areas is where we're putting lots of things together and we're actually really able to think. The rat not doing a whole lot of thinking, mostly guided by its movement, its motor abilities, and its senses. A cat over here, also very led by its sensory abilities, its motor movements, but it's a little bit higher up in the ability chain here, and it's got some association areas. The chimp also has motor and sensory areas, but then it has a much bigger association area, so it has some higher level thinking. But then humans have the most association areas, most cortex area. We still have motor areas and sensory areas. Back here is actually where vision is processed. But the cortex, all of the important thinking stuff is going on in there. The cortex, the cerebral cortex is divided into two hemispheres, and each of those hemispheres are divided into 4 lobes. Like I said, we'll get back into these a little bit more in the next section. But the cerebral cortex is the brain's outer bark layer. The cerebrum and the cerebral cortex, we almost use them interchangeably. The cerebral cortex is actually the most outer layer of the cerebrum, and the cerebrum is kind of all of the wrinkly area. So the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex, they handle complex mental activities, sensing, learning, thinking, planning, divided into our left and our right brains, or our 2 cerebral hemispheres. And then there are these major grooves, and we call those grooves or divisions in the cortex fissures. And that's what separates our brain into 2 halves. And then we also have these natural divisions with the lobes of the brain. But that'll be in the next section. My mnemonic for this one, it's a little bit rough. I've got the cerebrum. He's a serious bum because he does a lot of complex thinking. So cerebrum, serious bum, complex thinking is what's happening up there. All right, our next one, and this is a subcortical structure, meaning it's under the cortex, is the thalamus. And the thalamus almost seems like it could be part of the hindbrain or the midbrain, but it's kind of lumped here in with the forebrain. The thalamus is almost like it's a fist at the very top of the brain stem. And its important job is that it is relaying signals that come up the spinal cord and up the brain stem, kind of their final stop, sensory signals, is the thalamus. And then the thalamus is going to direct it to different parts of the brain that are going to process it, to the auditory cortex, to the somatosensory cortex, to the visual cortex. So it is distributing all the incoming sensory signals except for smell. Smell will bypass the thalamus and go straight to the gustatory cortex. But the thalamus is our relay center for sensory signals. Got a bit of a stretch one here. The thalamus directs incoming sensory signals, but not smell. So I've got a traffic cop here, and he is directing sensory signals from the ear, eye, taste, and touch, but not smell. So the lamb is the sensory signal traffic director, sending signals to different parts of the brain. I know. All right, the next one is the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus has a lot of jobs. Mainly, it's regulating basic biological needs: hunger, thirst, sexual desire, body temperature. Hypothalamus, hypo means under, so it literally means it's located under the thalamus. It's this pinkish area on the diagram. It's not very big. It's only about the size of a kidney bean, but it's a pleasure center, and it's got a lot of important jobs. A few more of those jobs here on our next slide. It controls the autonomic nervous system. So it's what triggers the sympathetic and parasympathetic responses, or our fight or flight and rest and digest responses. The hypothalamus connects the brain and the endocrine system. We haven't learned about the endocrine system yet, but it is hormones. And it controls the endocrine system through the pituitary gland, which is the master gland of the endocrine system. And the hypothalamus is part of the limbic system, which we'll get to next. So we can kind of narrow down the hypothalamus's jobs into the 4 F's: fighting and fleeing, so fight or flight response; feeding, because it controls hunger, partly through hormones; and fun times, or fooling around, or mating, or fornication, whichever F you choose to use. But the 4 F's, hypothalamus, lots of jobs there. A few other things we've talked about with the hypothalamus, some other experiments. There was the one where the rat kept accidentally stimulating his hypothalamus, which was a dopamine-rich area, and he stimulated it so much that he had a dopamine overdose, and he died heavily. Some other experiments were done where the experimenters or researchers lesioned or cut out different sides of the hypothalamus. When they cut out the lateral side, that's what tells you when you're hungry. So without that, the animals would starve. And then on the other side, they stimulated a different rat. They stimulated the lateral hypothalamus. And when they constantly stimulated it, told it it was hungry. So it's going to eat and eat and eat, and it gained weight rapidly. That's what happened with the one that's in the picture there. Our next region of the brain is the limbic system, and the limbic system is multiple brain parts together. All of these are subcortical, so under the cortex, loosely connected, and together they control emotions, memory, motivation. They're part of the pleasure centers. That includes the hypothalamus, so that fun times one, the hormones, that's part of emotion, the thalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. We have an emotional tree here. He's got emotional tree limbs with all kinds of memories and emotions and affirmations here. So the limbic system controls emotions, emotional tree limbs. One of the key parts of the limbic system is the hippocampus. Hippocampus, a lot of people are familiar with that word, but maybe not necessarily what it does. And the hippocampus's big job is that it helps to form long-term memories, specifically explicit memories, which are conscious memories. Now, the hippocampus does not actually store the memories. So the hippocampus is this kind of swirly thin part here, and on the blue one, you can see kind of wraps around there. So it is forming memories, but then those memories are sent and stored all throughout the cortex. So people often get that wrong. The hippocampus makes memories, but it does not store the memories. So the hippocampus, hippos must remember where their classes are on campus. Hippocampus, long-term memory formation. Our next one that is part of the limbic system is the amygdala. And the amygdala is sort of this knob here at the end of the hippocampus, and it handles intense emotions like anger, aggression, rage, and the fear responses. So anger and fear all in the same part of the brain. They're very, very similar responses. Amygdala, intense emotions. Uh, Frequently remember amygdala as sort of this kind of cartoonish character, Amy G. Dalla instead of amygdala, but Amy G. Dalla, she's angry. She has a lot of rage. Amy G. Dalla, angry Amy. And then our final part of the limbic system here is the pituitary gland, which is just below the hypothalamus and about the size of a pea, not very big. But the pituitary gland is the master gland. It tells all the other glands what to do. It is the head of the endocrine system. It's producing hormones from the thyroid and the adrenal glands, so adrenaline. Produces growth hormones and things that are necessary for sexual maturation, and it's right there next to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is the boss of the pituitary gland, which controls the endocrine system. So we've got a CT MRI scan here of the brain for a quick recap. We've got our spinal cord coming up through the neck to the hindbrain. The hindbrain includes the brainstem, where these most basic functions for life are processed. The reticular activating system is alerting the brain to incoming signals. The medulla is where breathing and heart rate are processed. The pons for sleep and arousal. The cerebellum over here, the mini brain, balance, posture, fine motor control, implicit procedural memories. And then at the top of the brainstem there, we've got the thalamus, which is directing signals that are coming up the spinal cord to different parts of the brain. Below the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus, the 4Fs, fight or flight, feeding, fun times, or all the hormones that go with sexual desire. The pituitary gland, processing hormones in the endocrine system. We've got the corpus callosum, those nerve fibers that are connecting the two hemispheres of the brain. And then finally, all along the top up here, cerebral cortex, where all of our higher level thinking and mental processing is happening.